Hello, YouTubers. Joe Kersey here on Sunday, September 21st, 2014 at 1:30 in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time. I went to the 8 o'clock service this morning, and the Reverend Roseanne uh, gave a splendid sermon. Uh, Today's text involved the Exodus 16 story of the manna in the wilderness, and then the Matthew 20 story of the laborers in the vineyard, and the subsequent pay dispute that they had with the fellow that hired them and gave them some work for the day. At various times, the guys that got hired with just an hour to go got the same pay as the guys that got hired first thing in the morning. And this, both those stories deal with complaints. You have the complaints of the Israelites in the desert, and then the complaints of the workers who were hired first, and actually maybe, although they don't really talk about it, the complaints of the workers who were hired in the middle of the day, when they saw that the people hired right at the end got the same amount of pay that they did. Everybody got paid the same, agreed wage. And this leads into a discussion of fairness. Human ideas of fairness and God's ideas of fairness, which obviously, since this is a parable, it's meant to illustrate something about redemption and salvation. But a lot of people can't move beyond just their human gripes. Fair is an interesting word. The dad of a very good friend of mine in college, I was up there for Thanksgiving and Christmas one year, and it was a big family. So the younger ones occasionally would bring up this thing about, it's not fair. And their dad would say, fair is clothes on your back, a roof over your head, and food in your belly, and everything else is just extra. And I've always thought that was just about the wisest thing I've ever heard in my life, and I still think that. So, in the eyes of God, all of the workers were being treated fairly. They all received enough money to provide the wherewithal for their families for that day. That's fair. That's fair. That's justice. That's equity justice. That's not legal law court contract justice. That's equity justice. If people can come to accept the fact that God's justice is not executed according to human constructs, if people can accept that, then there'll be peace and ideally reconciliation between all parties, and reconciliation between us and God, humans and God. Roseanne said, and this is a very interesting statement. This is a quote as near as I can recall it. Roseanne said, "Grace happens when God's love and God's justice come together." Well, I thought that was a very interesting thing about grace happening. I think a lot of times I certainly thought about grace is. God bestows grace. But grace is happening. Then you have love coming in, merging with justice, and that produces God's grace. That produces grace. I got thinking about that a little bit more, and you can have the coming together in the middle to result in grace, Or you can also think of this as grace exploding out into the world. God's grace explodes into the world, and it promotes love and justice. Or, as an equivalent, God's love and God's peace, using peace as a justice equivalent. So, the first working of this was love and justice converge and grace happens. The second working of this could be grace explodes out to produce love and justice. And this leads me then to think some more. And I think I've said here on some of these videos in the past that I tried to do and speak deeds of truth in peace and love. Do and speak deeds of truth in peace and love. Well, you can ring the changes on that. Do deeds of love in truth and peace. And when you put it that way, then you have love interacting with truth, and truth interacting with peace, and then vice versa, peace interacting with truth. And in this case, truth is an equivalent to grace. It's a grace equivalent. Truth is a grace equivalent. And peace is a justice equivalent, which eventually, ideally, results in reconciliation between parties in conflict, whether they're human being and human being or human beings and God. And then, to be complete, another change is do deeds of peace in truth and love. And it works basically pretty much the same way as the previous example, but it just depends on your starting point. So, here, as I said, truth is the equivalent of grace. Of course, love is love, and peace is the equivalent of equity justice, or God's justice, which is meant to promote peace and reconciliation, even if it's in a counterintuitive way. I mean, the obvious counterintuitive example was in today's gospel of the workers working 1 hour getting the same pay as the workers that worked 8, 9, 10 hours. In both stories, people were taken care of. The Israelites were fed. The workers were all provided with the daily wherewithal to be fed. The marginalized, who, as Roseanne pointed out, might well have been the last ones hired, since they were the ones that would be the least desirable, perhaps, to be picked up, and hired, were taken in and treated with dignity. And so this has God's grace and God's truth exploding into the world. They were exploding into the world, demonstrating and promoting God's love and God's justice and peace. And ideally, reconciling us to each other and to God. So, on that note, bye-bye, YouTubers.